Hi, and welcome to Tools Friday with FIXITGEARWARE-SECURITY. Today, on our Tools Friday, we'll be discussing a few topics in cybersecurity, which are passive recon, active recon, which is also known as reconnaissance, and enumeration. So the reason why we chose this topic is the fact that we have been churning out tools, and of course, various cybersecurity experts as well has been sharing posts regarding cybersecurity tools that are very essential for conducting automation testing when it comes to various penetration testing or bug bounty related activities. But while all these tools are being shared, as we believe so, we have an understanding that a lot of people misconstrue the word recon in the sense that they perform these actions without having a clear understanding of what they're actually doing when it comes to the various recon activities they are carrying out. So, what do we mean by this? For example, let's say you are a cybersecurity expert who is inclined to bug bounty related activities, right? Then you pick a target, you research about this target via any forms or means you understand that you can carry out your recon activities. At each stage of the recon, do you actually have an idea of what you're really doing? So, what do we mean by do you have an idea? Like, do you really have a clear understanding if the actions you're taking, if it's an active recon, if it's a passive recon, or if it's actually enumeration, and the orderliness on how you should carry out these various events or activities when it comes to sourcing information about these various targets you're trying to pen test or exploit for vulnerabilities, which probably you end up reporting as a bug. And of course, you'll be rewarded for that. So all those things are very important when it comes to cybersecurity related activities, especially when we're talking about ethical hacking. And that's the reason why we picked up this topic this week for our Tools Friday to be able to make a presentation of this. So by the time we're done, you should be able to have a clear understanding, not just these activities or actions you're carrying out, but understand the right order you should carry out these activities. And of course, leverage this benefits of carrying out these activities in terms of the recon process you're taking actions on, or the enumeration process you're carrying out to obtain reliable information which you can be able to now use to find more vulnerabilities and of course report to these various targets or organizations that are participating in the various campaigns on this bug bounty platform. So without further ado, having explained all this, let's get started with this week's episode. So Recon explained. For you to have an overview and understanding of Recon, we decided to use your day-to-day activities or what you actually go through in terms of the fruits of food or existence in terms of sports you carry out to explain these various activities today. So, for example, we have the AWS services. We use the strawberry. So, it's always sweet because AWS offers a lot of functions and activities you can perform on the platform. We also have the Windows Server. We call it the sweet grapes. So, for Windows Server, we call it the sweet grapes because sometimes the grapes are sweet and sometimes it's sour. Like you know that Windows is a good operating system with good GUI, which is the graphical user's interface, and not just a good GUI. It also makes it more easy for computer novice or IT non-practitioners who are just getting used to technology, have a way and a clear understanding to navigate to various functionalities provided by these windows. But at the same time, we know that over the years, Windows have always been having bugs related issues, vulnerabilities, and of course, attacks from threat actors, external forces, which are known as malicious hackers. So we ascribe the grapes to Windows Server in terms of sometimes it's sweet and sometimes it's sour. Now, for software, we used oranges. So oranges are your daily fruits. You need them, of course, They are very sweet. They are very essential because of the vitamin C contained in them. But at the same time, these oranges also attract ants, which we know that do not mean well whenever you find them in your home environment, right? So these ants can also be hackers who are looking for loopholes or a foothold into your internal organization resources. Can definitely use those apps, especially if they are vulnerable, to get access to your organization. So for website, we chose the hen, and of course the hen, which is the female chicken, um, lays eggs, right? So the eggs are like the babies. And of course, when you go to various websites, especially if they are framework based, they have a lot of components, which they call. These components can be external components, and the mode of communications are called APIs, which is the application programming interface, right? So these are the eggs or the babies that are resting on the womb of the hen, which is your website. So we chose that for this demonstration that this is what the website should be like. Now, when you come to EDR, the EDR, we know it's something that has to do with not just detection, but also provisioning responses to various vulnerabilities detected, right? So these vulnerabilities can be outdated components, it could be software updates, and so on. So EDR also provision these resources in terms of update and patches in a swift manner, and of course, while retaining the agility of not compromising or crashing the endpoint devices that is being administered with these updates remotely. So we use the horses to assign the EDR. Now for the surveillance systems, we know the surveillance system is like the CCTV, which also we classify as the intercoms in terms of when you are using it internally in your organization, right? And CCTVs don't also serve as surveillance system. They also serve as a form of perimeter security. And of course, if you're familiar with the farmlands, you know the goat is always hovering around the farmlands, right? And very, very resistant, like stubborn. It's always everywhere, moving around. So if there's a human passing by, the goat will always like be observing and following the human, right? So that's why we use the goat to represent the CCTV or the surveillance system. Now, when it comes to GitHub, we know what GitHub is all about. So it's not just a platform, but it's a platform where you can host your code repositories, right? And collaborators as well have access to these codes. They can be invited to private repositories, which are not made public, and of course, participate in terms of contributing into the development of that specific repositories. So, and of course, the ship has a lot of furs, and those furs are used as wool when they are shared to, develop clothes and the panties we all wear, the linens, right? These are all from the wool from a ship. So all those various components in terms of codes, API keys, and other forms of secret informations that are resting in these codes that is hosted on these GitHub repositories are very vital informations, right? So these informations also are like force of the ship. And that's the reason why we use the ship to represent GitHub. Now for ticketing, we used the pigs. So you might think, oh, but the pig is like daddy, they play daddy. Uh, Pig here in the essence is that it's fat. It has a lot of meat. Now, of course, when you talk about ticketing systems, we're not just talking about ticketing systems that are capable of issuing tickets related to problems that are yet unresolved. Ticketing system can also serve as a platform for payment. So when you talk about payment platform here, we're talking about most organizations have a lot of customers, right? So they deploy their payment platforms or they outsource their payments platforms through third-party services. So these third-party services, while they are making these deductions or charging these various customers on behalf of the client, in this case, the organization, right? They also retain sensitive informations. So these sensitive informations are now used by the organizations to reference their payment records. You know, it's like more of like a check and balance. If you have worked in the bank industry, you understand why these organizations have certain informations about the client's payments they share with the organization who is also their client. So it's like you, the user of their platform, is the client of that organization, right? And the organization that is responsible for um, carrying out the payment responsibilities in terms of charges to these users, of course, who is a customer to this organization, right? Also has that organization as their own customer, right? So this payment platform or ticketing system also contains sensitive information that can also be leveraged. And when you talk about ticketing systems, we're not just talking about payment platforms as well. We're also talking about provisioning. So solution provisioning here is like when you have a problem and you report this problem to the organization, right? Your system informations are recorded on this various ticketing system. It could be your IP address, it could be your home address, it could be your phone number, it could be your personal email address. You don't want to be on the public internet, right? These are very sensitive informations. So you can see designating the ticketing system as a PIC means it's like it's secure, but also has a flashy or useful information, right? That it contains. Now, moving on to the Cisco servers. I know you are saying, why did we say Cisco servers? So Cisco, as you know, is not just providing routers and switches or firewalls. They also provide servers. So we have the USCX, we have the USCB, which is for the blade servers and so on. So we use the fish icon to let you understand that fishes have varieties, right? So in the sea, we know we have the shark, we have the tilapia, we have the eels, and so on, right? So these are various types of fishes out there. And of course, that is the reason why we demonstrated Cisco servers as fishes. Now for Apache server, the bananas, right? Okay, so using bananas here today, we are trying to make you understand that bananas are very essential, right? They have potassium, they have other subsequent nutrients. I'm not a medical expert, but I know definitely there's a lot of potassium necessary for the body that the banana itself as a fruit contains, right? So when you talk about Apache server doesn't necessarily mean a product. It means that the server in question runs the Apache software. And of course, we know the Apache server, which runs the Apache software, runs on the HTTP protocol, right? And this protocol is responsible for delivering web pages or contents to you, the end user. So we felt we should use this your daily activities or experiences to explain these various concepts. So by the time we are done explaining these various um, processes in information gathering, you'll be able to appreciate the understanding you have gained so far. And of course, use this information to carry out your daily activities, not even just as a bug bounty hunter, but in the eventuality that you end up becoming a penetration tester, right? You can now be able to leverage these informations in an orderly manner, obtain sensitive results that are meant for your clients, and of course, carry out the various tasks onwards with reference to whatever conversations you have had during the pre-engagement discussions or pre-engagement phase. So having described this whole components, let's move on to the next phase, which is of course describing what a passive recon or passive reconnaissance is all about. Now, when we talk about passive recon, let's explain this from a job perspective. On the first part of the job explanation, we have what we call the job 81A. So we use this labeling form so that you can understand what we are explaining at each phase of the information we are passing on to you. Now, let's talk about the organization and how you can leverage this information during the process of your passive recon. So when you visit a job site, such as Indeed, right? Or any other job site the first information you will get is the title of the job. So it could be hiring for the role of a junior cybersecurity expert, or hiring for the role of chief information security officer, or hiring for the role of system administrator, or hiring for the role desktop support L1, L2, right? So these are job titles. These job titles give you an insight of what the organization is expecting in terms of the type of candidates they want to employ in their infrastructure, right? Now, after the title, the first thing the organization does is to do a brief introduction. So, what is this brief introduction all about? This brief introduction is always about the history or their origin, the nature of their business, the regions which they are based. So they can say they have regions in the United States, they have in Australia, they have in Africa, they have in Asia, and other parts of the world or continents that exist geopolitically, right? Now, not just that, a bit information these organizations also leave during the about the organization can be information such as they have been in the industry for like 10, 15 years. And during that period, they have contributed towards the development of technology or environmental protection, depending on the nature of the business of this organization, because it mustn't be an IT company to need an IT professional, right? Every organization need an IT professional. So now, when you now see these informations, it could be contributions they have made in terms of donations, supporting a good cause. It could also be resources committed into R&Ds. So as we know, high profile organizations commit money into research and development, right? Now, let's say an organization that describe themselves, they feel so proud of how far they have come. And they say, okay, over the years, we have committed about $2 billion, or let's say, okay, $3 billion in our research and development processes, which we have carried out for the past 3 years. So now, in your own understanding, this organization definitely makes tons of money to be able to commit the sum of $3 billion, right, in R&Ds in a period of 3 years. Now, one of the vital information you have to understand is that when organizations commit resources into R&Ds, right, their goal is also to make profit. Okay, so it's like we know there's an impending problem out there in the society. We have committed this money to make a research about these problems. And of course, we want to provide these solutions. These solutions as well, we are now going to sell it. Since we are the new people to, bring up this idea, definitely we would have a large customer base, right? It could be a product, it could be a solution, it could also be a training, whatever it is. They definitely gonna make a lot of money. And that money is what we call revenue, right? Now, if they have committed $3 billion for research in the last 3 years, of course, every organization would always want 100% returns, right? In terms of the revenue they generate from these contributions they have made. So, what does this mean? If I have spent $3 billion for the past 3 years for my R&Ds, right? There's 100% chance that I've made $6 billion within that period of 3 years. Because of course, the first year I committed 1 billion, I have seen a result, which of course is tangible result. The second year I also committed additional 1 billion. And of course, I've seen a substantial result. That is the motivation, right? To now contribute an additional 1 billion on the third year to have a more profit in terms of income generations in the organization. So the more a good result is gotten from the existing commitment, the more these organizations commit. So now, how does this information help in your passive recon? If you're an ethical hacker, you should understand that this organization deals with a large customer base. That is number one. Number two, they make a lot of money, which of course their reputation is at stake here. They wouldn't want to have a bad reputation. Number three, any information you get from obtaining critical vulnerabilities from these organizations' resources or infrastructures they use in conducting their businesses definitely would amount to a positive reward. So now that has given me an insight that I am dealing with a very rich and powerful organization. And so more, they have a lot of components they work with. And with that being said, there's a lot of things I could gain whenever I'm pen testing this particular target. So that is number one key point you have gotten from about the organization. Now, moving on to the job description. Job description is an overview of what the organization is expecting from the intending candidate. So let's say, for instance, they are hiring for a desktop support role, and this organization says that you must be familiar with cloud services, for example, Amazon Web Services Cloud, or GCP, which is Google Cloud Platforms, or Microsoft Azure, also known as Entra ID. It gives me an insight that these organizations are in partnership with these various organizations' cloud services in order to carry out their daily activities. Now, if I have to look at this from an ethical hacker perspective, thinking outside the box, the first thing that is going to come to my mind is that they could either be using these clouds as a form of storage, they could be either be using this cloud as a form of hosting, or they could be using this cloud for other services that is being provided by these various organizations. So now, if I have to search further about these various organizations they have mentioned, I have to now research on the various cloud services they provide and what each of the services are used for. And now, from the first information we have gotten from the about the organization, we can now narrow it down to fit our further searches regarding these various clouds. So let's say, of course, they've been doing research and development, right? And they've been committing a lot of resources in doing this various research and development. Of course, this requires documenting reports, right? And now they have stated in the job description that they need someone who is very familiar with cloud. It gives me an insight that, okay, they might be using this cloud for storing their various documents. Of course, they don't want to put it on premise because there could always be a failure or a hacker penetrating the internal organization network, right? And of course, crashing the entire system. And they don't want to lose those information. So they backed it up on the cloud, right? So it has given me another direction or sense of belonging that this is another information that I should look out for regarding this organization. So you see how passive recon is so beautiful. First of all, we have gotten information about the organization, then we moved on to the job description, right? To narrow down our options of the informations we have to research on the internet. So we don't just move vaguely or just move without a sense of direction. And now you can see how everything is fitting. These pieces are all fitting like a Rubik's, picked apart. We are gradually fixing them back to get a good cube shape. Now, after we have understood the various description in terms of the job description, we'll now move on to the requirements. Why is this very important in passive recon? Requirements will tell you or give you an insight of the level of data or informations that you will be handling as the one who is seeking for this job. But in this case, you and I know you're not seeking for the job. You're just a penetration tester or bug bounty hunter. So you want to have an idea of what the organization is all about, right? That was the essence of the passive recon. Now they could say, okay, we require you to have an OSCP because it's a general certification, right? Now, in my head, as a cybersecurity professional, we know that the OSCP has to do with penetration testing. So whenever I see an OSCP as a requirement in an organization, I believe that there are various components. It could be the cloud, it could be their web application, it could be their mobile application, or any form of applications this organization use for their businesses needs a constant penetration testing. So now I have to start thinking of what next should I be looking at? I should start looking for informations regarding the various applications these organizations use for their business, right? Which I want to pen test. Now, let's say it's not just OSCP, right? And they say they want CISSP. Now it tells me about risk management, risk assessment. We're not just talking about the applications, we're talking about governance here. We're talking about data security here. We're talking about information security here, right? it also gives me an insight that these organizations are handling a lot of informations that they want someone who is very familiar with the industry and laws, right, to be able to lead the organization in this particular field, which has been put out there to be the requirement for the job, right? Now, let's say they also ask for other certification like OSMR. So we're talking about Mac here, right? Which is the Macintosh or Mac OS based operating system. It gives me an insight that, okay, not just that the fact that this organization has an application, probably all the infrastructure in terms of the computer hardware they use in the internal organization is Macintosh based product or Apple based product. So with that, I have to now say, okay, I have to look into more informations about Mac, aside looking for more informations about the various applications, either web or mobile, that this organization use in conducting their day-to-day business, or which their clients or users interact with. Now you see, we are now picking up the pieces, right? From about the organizations and their financial capabilities down to the job requirements in terms of an idea of the type of infrastructure they handle or use, and now we're talking about the requirements in terms of information given as a tip from the requirements. And now let's now move on to the final part, which is the numeration and benefits. Now, numeration and benefits is also a clue in passive recon. Now, you might be asking, how does numeration and benefit is a part of a clue in passive recon? Now, for example, you cannot be applying for the job role of a junior pen tester, right? Let's just shift away from the initial job description we described so you can have an understanding of what we're saying right now. You cannot be applying for the job role of a junior penetration tester, and this organization says, okay, for the role of a junior penetration tester, we're going to be paying you $30,000 a month. It's not feasible, right? It's not even possible. So entry level jobs, basically, we're talking about from 3,000 US dollars to about probably 5,000 US dollars or 4,000 US dollars per month. These are the salary range of entry level jobs, right? Now, let's say while you were reading about these numerations and benefits, you saw the basic salary to be $25,000 per month with additional benefits of holidays, family events, medical insurance, dental insurance, paid leaves. So all these things, right, as they are like additional benefits you'll be getting aside your basic salary. So let's say by the time we have amounted these figures and financial obligations of the organizations towards you, if you're the successful candidate, we are now getting close to about $35,000 to $40,000 a month. That gives you an idea that this job role you're about to go for is not just a job role, it's a very expensive job role. So you have a lot of informations to deal with or a lot of informations to handle, right? Me as an ethical hacker, now I have picked up the pieces and put it together from the amount of resources they commit in their R&Ds to the job description in terms of the infrastructures and what I will be doing if I am the candidate, to the requirements in terms of the certification, and now the numeration and benefit. Now, putting all these pieces together, I have been able to get a good Rubik's Cube, fitting the right components together to just get the cube square, right? And of course, now understand that this is exactly how I should channel my research further when I'm going to be using resources like Google to get information about this organization. So you see how the beauty of passive recon is from the job ads perspective, right? This has given us an insight that, okay, this is what this organization is all about. If I have to use the dark web or if I have to use Bing to research about this organization. And that is it, how you can conduct a successful passive recon using job ads displayed on various job platforms. Now, let's now further explain passive recon. With this entire pieces of information we have gotten, right, from the previous explanation using the job descriptions, information about the organizations, requirements, benefits, and numeration, right? Now we have been able to have a clear understanding of what we now want to further research. We are not yet interacting with the target, okay? We now use Google to research about this organization. It could be to gather information about the various third parties which they are engaged with in their various businesses. So using Google, I can say, for example, let's say I type hacker1 colon McDonald's. So what am I trying to do is this. I'm trying to research about McDonald's to understand if they have any vulnerability disclosure program with HackerOne. You might be asking, okay, why am I researching about that? It's for me to also have an understanding of the various endpoints they are using. So if they are based on IPs, in terms of if I check the BBP programs, which is the bug bounty programs, right? I can now say, okay, probably they deal with a lot of servers, right? Given the value of the IP range that was supplied. Now, let's say, okay, I don't want to use HackerOne through the vulnerability research program. I want to research with Cisco. I can type Cisco colon, not semicolon, colon, and I would say McDonald's. When I type this information like this, every information that has to do with Cisco in relation with the organization McDonald's is going to pop up on the Google search. So this information that has now appeared on the Google search, I will not be able to use this information to understand about this organization. I could see information like, okay, 3 days ago, McDonald's partnered with Cisco in installing the USCX server. Now, if I have to research information about USCX server, I have to research about the operating system, how the server component works, and of course, all the versions of the operating system that this server runs and what vulnerabilities these particular versions are vulnerable to. Now, let's shift from Cisco servers. Let's say, okay, they deal with a ticketing platform or the third party service B, right? Let's say they use platforms such as Jira or Salesforce, right? I can now research about the organization and its usage with Salesforce. And this information can now give me an understanding to like, okay, am I going to try some forms of attack whenever I'm going to be involving into the active recon side of my activity? Am I going to try to brute force some credentials and so on? So now I've gotten information about the third party be that, okay, they use a ticketing system such as Salesforce. I have an understanding of what next to do, right? Now, let's say for third party service C would be their surveillance system, which organizations they purchase the surveillance system from, right? I can now research about these organizations and, of course, know the type of surveillance system they sell to this organization that I'm trying to pen test. The reason is that with this information, I can now find a way to try and gain access during my active recon process to the internal organization's surveillance system. And of course, you can survey things like what they are doing. If the CCTV is sitting in the internal office, you could do show the surfing via the CCTV if you know what you're actually doing, right? So still on the passive recon, you can see how we have now moved on from the job ad information, narrowing it down to passive recon using Google search. And now that we have gotten this understanding, it's starting to become clearer how we should go about our recon process, right? It is yet to get interesting in the next explanation. Now, the next explanation is what we call the active recon. So what are we talking about active recon? You can see right here, we have the hacker sitting on the organization. So this is a cute firm, and this hacker is directly engaging with this organization right now. And by directly engaging with this organization, the hacker is now about to perform the real recon to verify these various resources which he has gathered using the passive recon approach. So, for example, let's say for the AWS services, right? The hacker has to conduct a port scanning. Now, you might be asking, why is it a port scanning? Of course, AWS services do not just serve as storage, you can also host your apps on them. And of course, this app communicate over a port, right? For HTTP, we know that it's port 80. For HTTPS, we know that it's 443, right? So the hacker can decide to scan these organizations' various AWS services URLs that they've gotten from the passive recon, of course, which has to do with subdomains and domains, findings, and discover more information about this target. Now, in this case, they are directly interacting with the target or the third party services that this target is using in conducting their day-to-day activities. On traceroute, you might be saying, why is it traceroute for AWS services? In AWS services, there's what we call regions and availability zone. So what are regions? Regions are like United States, Asia, Africa, and so on. These are regions. Now, for each region, AWS has three availability zones, except the United States, because for the United States, each region has two availability zones. And of course, AWS has a lot of servers in the United States, right? Now, let's say you are an organization, you cater for about 300 million customers, right? And these 300 million customers access your application. That's quite a lot of load, right? Now you need what we call a load balancer. So what is a load balancer, or what is the job of the load balancer? It distributes traffic to these various availability zones, which your app is hosted on. So let's say I am trying to access FIXITGEARWARE.com, which was hosted on AWS, right? And we have about three availability zones. And on a day-to-day basis, we have about 500 million traffics coming to our website. Let's just assume this figure. Now, to be able to cater for these 500 million viewers or readers without experiencing downtime, we have to now integrate what we call the load balancer. So when the traffic is overwhelming coming to a particular zone, the load balancer will redirect the other traffic to the next availability zone. So by such doing, the traffic moving across my network is distributed and shared, right? So with traceroute, I can now decide to understand how this traffic is hopping across the network. And of course, understand the various IPs that I need to communicate with in order to get these various resources from this organization. This also gives me an idea of the range of IP address that I have to scan. Now, going on the Windows server, we have to use port scanning and traceroute. So what is port scanning? We want to scan the ports to understand the various services that are open on this Windows server, right? Now on traceroute, let's say this Windows server is hosted on premise cloud. So it's internal organization facility that is running this Windows server, right? And of course, it's not just one or a single Windows server. They have multiple Windows servers which are virtualized. And these multiple Windows servers are communicating with one another. I can use traceroute to understand the communication that goes within these multiple visualizations, right? And gain access in terms of which of these various visualizations that is running this Windows server is vulnerable, which of course I can now possibly exploit to gain an initial foothold to the internal organizations. So aside scanning the ports for open services, I'm also using traceroute to discover various IP addresses or the IP range that is existing in the internal organization infrastructure when it comes to the Windows server. Now, let's move on to software. When you talk about softwares, I know you'll be thinking we're just talking about browsers. No, big organizations don't just use browsers, right? They use protocols such as SSH to communicate with various machines. This can run using a client or installing SSH client directly via the terminal and using the terminal to gain access. While we can assume that, okay, this organization uses the terminal to access its SSH services, certain organizations prefer using a client base. So what is the client base is that, let's say we have the PuTTY, right? For PuTTY, we just have to provide the IP address, provide the port, login credentials, and we run. PuTTY is now going to remotely communicate to these IPs, which this information has been provided, and of course, establish an SSH communication. Consider this like an RODP kind of communication, which is the remote desktop protocol when you use the SSH client installed on your computers or servers. Now, these applications can also be vulnerable depending on the versions you're using. So if they're vulnerable means if your SSH is running An attacker can intercept your traffic, can sniff your data, and of course, get some keys which are not supposed to be possible to decrypt these data, right? So you see how port scanning can also help. And of course, when we are scanning ports, which that particular application is communicating with. So for SSH, we know that it uses port 22, right? And if they're also using FTP, we also have to get the ports also discovered as well. Now, moving on to website, we're talking about status code. We all know in Active Recon, the website is visible, right? But why are we talking about status code? Let's say the website is built to communicate with various APIs, right? While we are researching about the various API that we discovered in this website, we also want to check that if this API is actually valid. It could be that we are looking for 200 OK. It could be that we're looking for a 301 redirect. It could also be that we're looking for a 403, which is also forbidden. These are all the status codes we want to look out for. So those little crumbs or links that exist in the website of the organizations definitely talk to one another. And these links are the reasons why we should check for status code. So if we cannot gain access into the organization through its original or official website, we can as well gain access to the internal organization resources through various API calls or API component that this organization is calling or talking to in order to render certain informations on its website. Now for EDR, why should we do port scanning for EDR? The nature of EDRs is we have the cloud-based client and we have the remote clients, which will be installed on the endpoint or computer, which we want to administer this endpoint detection services on. So let's say, for example, the version of the EDR you installed on the endpoint device is vulnerable to a specific security weakness. You can now scan this port to see if the EDR service is active. And of course, we know constantly the EDR services has to be running so that remotely the security administrator can be able to monitor what's going on the system and of course deploy various updates when necessary. So let's say you have an endpoint device which has not updated the client that was installed on the endpoint device, right? If a hacker detects that port which the EDR is communicating over the network, right? And discover that, okay, this port is sending some communications and it's open. Now I have to research which port or which application uses this port, right? Now, from there, I can now further perform more sinister act. It could be to look for POCs. It could be to look for additional information on how to use that port as an entry point to the internal organization resources. And of course, we know the issues about what happened to CrowdStrike, right? So these are just like examples of why port scanning is very important to the EDR services when you're conducting your active recon. Now for surveillance systems, we have what we call the port scanning and brute forcing. So port scanning, we want to know what port, let's say for instance, the surveillance system communicates over the internet. So it's an IP protocol based surveillance system. You can easily access it just by typing the IP address remotely from anywhere in the world and you gain access to the admin portal. Now, let's say you have gotten access to the admin portal and you try the default login. However, the default logins are not working, right? So to further gain access to the administrative dashboard, you can now further do what we call brute forcing. So you can supply a few word lists or much word lists depending on the size of your word list. And use this word list and password to conduct brute forcing attacks. And if you're successful, you can be able to gain information or credentials which you can use in properly logging in to this IP based surveillance system. Now for GitHub, port scanning is very important. So what does the port scanning on GitHub does is that you scan for these ports. You want to see open GitHub instances. Now, most organizations, as we know, have enterprise-based servers, which they self-host their own GitHub. So instead of using the GitHub itself, which is the platform provided by Microsoft, they self-host their own GitHub on their own server. So you can scan for these ports to see instances of GitHub that are open, and of course, find security flaws in it. It could be credentials, passwords, API keys. All these are very important informations, right? By having access to, of course, links that are going to reference to that particular resources when you have discovered them from scanning. Now, for ticketing systems, common attacks could be brute forcing. Let's say the administrator of the organization using these various ticketing systems are not that too security conscious, right? You can try brute forcing credentials to see if you can gain access to this ticketing system. And of course, when you try brute forcing, it doesn't work. You cannot try what we call credential stuffing. So credential stuffing here in the sense that, let's say they did not implement MFA, which is the multi-factor authentication, or they're not using the new security implementation that is going viral now, which is the FIDO2 or the passkey authentication, right? So using credential stuffing, you can be able to gain access if the informations provided are valid. Of course, when you gain access, suddenly you know that a lot of informations will be at the disposal of you if you're a non-ethical hacker. And if you're an ethical hacker, you can also report this. And of course, this suddenly is a critical bug because we're talking about their clients' base information. You have access to these informations which are not supposed to be open to you as the ethical hacker, right? Now, let's move on to Cisco server. So for Cisco servers, we're doing port scanning and trace route. So for trace route is that we want to know the various servers that are communicating with one another. One could be the main server, the other one could be a backup server, right? So you have to understand these various IP address that are communicating with one another when you're conducting your trace route or port scanning. Now, if you're familiar with dynamic host configuration protocol, so you're dynamically assigning IP, right? You can also check the subnet mask. So the subnet can tell you the range of IP address this organization is communicating with. So let's say if I see a subnet of /254, it gives me an insight that this organization has a wide range of IP, right? I can now feed my tool a range of IP address that I want it to scan. So this range of IP address, if they are valid, I will definitely receive responses, right? And these responses will now tell me that, okay, from this range to this range, this IP address belongs to this organization, right? And with that, I can now move on to conduct further penetration testing or exploitation if I want to move on to that phase with the target. Now, on Apache server, you have to do port scanning. So why is it important to do port scanning is because we want to know which of the port is open. Is the Apache server opened on 80 or 443? Okay. This can also give us an insight on how to now access the various URL or domain we have. So let's say we have a range of IP and we have scanned for port 80. We can now try this IP on port 80. And let's say we have port 80 and port 443 or port 8080, depending on how the Apache server was configured. We can now try these various IP address with the various ports that we have found valid during our port scanning the Apache server. So with this summarized right now, you have an overview of how active recon is conducted, right? With these various services that is being used or provisioned by this organization. Let's move on to a more interesting part of this presentation. This is what we call enumeration. And as you can see, the diagram becomes a bit more complex. Now, let's explain enumeration further. Here you can see we have the hacker still directly relating to the target. Now, let's say for the AWS, right? When we're enumerating a service, we want to see what informations we can deeply obtain about this organization. So for the AWS services, we want to see if the URLs are active and if they're exposed to the public internet, right? This will also be a part of information we'll obtain. Now, for AWS, we are dealing with types, numbers, and use case. So, what are the types, right? Types here we mean is like, what are the types of services hosted with this AWS cloud? Are they containers? Are they used as storages? Okay, if they're used as storages, what is the size of information that has been discovered in this container, right? And if they're using it as a hosting services, right? What are the components running on these hosting services? Like, for example, if they're using frameworks or they are running additional informations, like they are hosting a VPS on this cloud, right? So this VPS, definitely we know they will be installing an operating system. It could be Windows, it could be Linux, it could be any distro. It could also be Ubuntu. Now we also want to check the version, right? What this version it's all about and if this version is vulnerable. You see the beauty of enumeration right now. We have now moved from recon to deeply getting information about the stack. And that is for just AWS, right? Now, let's go back again to numbers. Containers also have versions. Containers such as Docker and Kubernetes also have versions, right? So let's say we enumerate this AWS um, domain we have obtained. And we discovered that these applications are running on containers. And of course, you might be asking, why not directly installed? Why running on containers? Because containers are very easy to maintain. So let's say these organizations wants to put more information or update more features on their app. They don't need to be deploying source code. They just remotely do all these changes on the container and they deploy the container and of course take down the old container. So the new version container would now be the one running. And it also makes it very easy for these organizations to maintain and control how their application works. So let's say during the process when they deploy this container, the version of the container that they deployed is susceptible to DDoS attack, right? Me as a penetration tester, I can try some relay traffic to this target to see what's gonna happen or the behavior of this container. And if I'm able to take down the service temporarily for a period of time, depending on the impact of the traffic that I have sent, I can consider this as a vulnerability. So you see how enumeration is like. Enumeration is not just about gaining access to open services or if the service is valid, it's also getting more information about the services that we're enumerating. I could also enumerate for keys, configurations, policies that are not properly implemented. And enumeration will get this information and of course tell me more about the specific services running on the cloud, in this case, the AWS. Now moving on to Windows Server. We want to talk about active and exposure. So we know Windows Server runs a lot of applications, including Active Directory. So we want to understand if this is exposed, if the pod is running. So if the pod is open, we can now do what we call banner grabbing. If you're familiar with Nmap, which is also known as the Swiss Army knife, you are able to do seamless activities with Nmap. And this include checking for versions of the operating system, enumerating the applications that are running on that server and the versions. So let's say in this case, for the Windows, we're talking about types. What is the type of Windows that this server is running? It could be a Windows 7, it could be a Windows Server 2019. Nmap is going to pull out this information and present to us. Now, in terms of storage, this will be achieved when we further use tools such as Metasploit framework. If we have detected a vulnerability that we can exploit to gain internal access to the organization, right? So we can now use a series of commands. If we have gained a foothold, either through definitely reverse shell, not bind shell, we can then check the storage size. And the storage size will give us an insight of the type of data that is contained in the server. Now, let's talk about services. Of course, we're talking about, is it running SSH? Is it running FTP, right? If SSH is installed, what is the version? So you see how enumeration becomes so beautiful. It's not just checking these services if they are open, it's also telling us with the banner grabbing feature, the versions of these various services running on this Windows server. And that is how clear enumeration is. when it comes to enumerating for Windows services. Now let's move on to softwares. Let's say this organization have a lot of softwares. We have previously said about PuTTY, right? And of course, this PuTTY is for SSH. Now we can enumerate and also get banner information. So the software can be PuTTY, and Nmap with the banner grabbing feature will tell us that, okay, I found PuTTY installed, and this PuTTY has a specific version, okay? And it's running on this port. Now, as a penetration tester, I can now use this version information to look for exploit codes or proof of concept in targeting this organization. And after I've achieved that, I can say, okay, further, let me now find a way to exploit these discoveries and, of course, report it as a bug, as this is the right thing to do. Now, moving on to website, we're talking about types and numbers. So when we talk about types here, we're also talking about exposure, okay? Now, for types, we're talking about, is it a framework based? Okay, if it's a framework based, what is the framework in use? Is it Vue.js? Is it React? Is it Angular? Is it a CMS based such as Wix? Or is it a framework based such as Laravel? Right? No. Exposure also helps us to understand the versions of these various applications. So these versions will tell us that, okay, this is the version of the framework that was used in building this website. And not just that, exposure also can expose the server information. So the version of the server that this web application or website is running on, if the security administrator did not properly implement a security header function that hides information about the server. No, not just that also. We're talking about databases, right? We can also understand the database that is being used and the version of the database, right? This is part of exposure. With this information, I can say, okay, this target uses, let's say they use MySQL is the commonly used database out there, right? And of course, the version displays, right? I can now say, okay, this version, I want to find information on how I can, exploit this version of database, right? And of course, this is also a security flaw which has been exposed using enumeration. Now let's move on to EDRs. So when we talk about EDRs, we're talking about active in terms of enumeration, right? So when we enumerate this, we want to check if the port which this client installed on the endpoint is running. And of course, we want to know what type it is. Let's say the EDR being smart, they use a serial number, not the name, but the version, of course, will definitely be displayed. I can now copy the serial number and put it in Google. And when I put it in Google, I can now further say, okay, where is this serial number referencing to? Definitely, there will always be a documentation out there. Either people has posted on Reddit about the same discovery, or the organization themselves, which provide these EDR services, have talked about. And with this, I can now further narrow down my research to find exploit codes or POCs for these particular versions that was detected by my Nmap tool. And that's how you can easily enumerate this type of services. Let's say there's an EDR client running on this target. Now let's move on to surveillance system. We're talking about models and versions. So lots of CCTV have models, right? And these models also are pertinent to various security flaws. Over the years, cybersecurity professionals have said about this. So I could also get an information during enumeration about the type and version. Okay. Type here, we're talking about the model, right? And version, we're talking about the operating system version or the hardware component version. Would be okay. Remotely, I can access this type of CCTV, and not just accessing this type of CCTV, I can also log in using default admin credentials. So if the organization were not, security conscious and they did not change these default credentials, I can now gain access. And not just gaining access, I can also find a way to create a specific user account so that I would not be noticed that I have gained access to this surveillance system, should in case they make up their mind to change these credentials, right? And not researching if another user has been created. And for future clients, I can now use these default credentials that I have created for myself to gain access to this IP surveillance system, and of course, monitor internal organizations, proceedings, or events going on. Now, for GitHub, when we talk about types and numbers here, we're talking about codes and credentials. So, what are the codes and credentials? We're talking about the code hosted on these GitHubs. So it could be various Python codes, PHP code, C or C++, Bash script. All these are codes. So if you, as a penetration tester or bug bounty hunter, you've gained access that, okay, this self-hosted GitHub is active and is exposed to the public internet, you want to scan through this code. It could be a source code for newly deployed applications, right? And this source code has hard-coded credentials such as API keys and so on, right? You want to pick those codes and, of course, try and test them and find a way to assess sensitive informations which you are not supposed to do to obtain access into these organizations, right? It could also be credentials such as usernames and passwords. They were used to test, you know, the application before deploying, right? But these passwords were not encrypted. They were just plain text password. And also, not just even plain text password, even after they've been deployed, they were not wiped away from the system. So it still exists in the original database that was, deployed to the live application. And you, as an ethical hacker, can test these credentials and try and log in and see if you can gain access. And once you can gain access, you definitely know that, okay, you have gained authority to perform certain acts you're not supposed to perform because, as we know, these credentials oftentimes are always super user or super level administrator. Now, on Cisco servers, you want to check the IP, if the IP is valid or active. And of course, enumerate what OS that the server is running. When you use tools like Nmap, it's going to get you the OS and model. And of course, with that OS, you can decide to further research on the internet for POCs, which you can now use to exploit this target. So you see, enumeration is good and perfect. You need to use enumeration in your day-to-day activities. As a cybersecurity expert, as a penetration tester or bug bounty hunter, and after you have done that, you can now use this information to further dig and of course find POCs, which is the normal thing to do, and move on to the next stage, which is exploitation. And lastly, on this slide, we are now going to talk about Apache Server. So when we talk about Apache Server, we're talking about its activeness and numbers. So when we talk about numbers, we're talking about versions. Certain versions of Apache Server are very vulnerable. Let's say when you check this information and your Nmap 2, in this case you're using for this enumeration, is able to pull this data that this is the particular version of Apache software this Apache server is running. You can now further dig into the internet and of course look for POCs which are pertinent to that version of vulnerability detected. And these POCs, you can now further use these POCs and of course exploit these Apache servers and gain access to the internal organization resources. And that is enumeration explained. And as you can see, the hacker also deployed various tools to conduct this various enumeration. It's not necessarily using Nmap, but Nmap is the go-to or is the universal tool used by every hacker, penetration tester, or bug bounty hunter when it comes to enumeration processes. So moving on to the next slide. This is now the definition of what we have just explained. So what is passive reconnaissance? Passive reconnaissance in penetration testing and ethical hacking is the gathering of information and data about a specific target or organization without any form of direct communication or interaction with a set target. The purpose is to ensure that all possible informations are gathered without the target noticing your presence on their network. And like as we said previously, during the passive recon explanation, we did all the research we did through job ads, through Google search, through dark web search, without necessarily accessing any domain or links that's associated with the target What is now active reconnaissance? Active reconnaissance, it involves the direct interaction with the target with the sole purpose of uncovering security flaws in the various valid endpoints or the target or network. This process comprises of port scanning, password cracking, etc. The goal is to identify this potential weakness which could be exploited by you, of course, the bug bounty hunter, or in this case, if we're considering a bad guy, a non-ethical hacker. Active recon often attracts the attention of the target, and this attraction makes them understand that something sinister is going on through their network or tampering their open services. So when you try to actively scan a target, it's about packets. So you're sending packets, you're sending data, and these targets are responding back to you. It could be a series of pings which you're not supposed to conduct that often, and these pings can slow down the network or services provided by this organization. And if there is something like a detecting system that has been implemented, they could be alerted that there is an insurge of traffic coming through into the network via your IP address. For example, the organization firewalls, IPS, which is the intrusion prevention system, or IDS, which is the intrusion detection system. These various protection mechanism can notice this intrusive presence and of course take auto-configured actions which can be blocking your IP address from accessing the resources or restricting your IP address from accessing the resources within a time frame while notifying the organization's security team. So not just blocking your IP address, there's what we call logs. Every server, every web application have a special configuration that keeps logs. So these logs are IP addresses and location where these IP are designated. So let's say if the security experts go through their log and they discover that a particular IP from Arkansas has been, or Oklahoma, or New York, or Brooklyn has been sending a lot of traffic within a span of 5 seconds. And this IP has been able to send 10,000 requests within a span of 1 minute. Let's just say that, right? It gives them an idea that this particular IP is trying to flood them with a traffic. And there's nothing else you can tell them about other than that this IP is trying to conduct a DDoS attack on them, right? So this is one of the challenges of active recon because there is no way you can gain access to the target without actively communicating with the target. Now, moving on to enumeration. Enumeration is the process of directly interacting and probing the target network or services with the sole purpose of gathering detailed information about its infrastructure. These informations include various applications and services running on the organization network, the version of service, username extraction, machine names, resources on the network, and so on. Information gathered during this phase is the foundation on which the exploitation is further conducted. So the Nmap tool was able to detect that the system runs a Windows 7, right? And not just a Windows 7, it tells us the service version, right? It could also be SMB ports. And of course, we know what SMB means, server mail block, and the one-time eternal blue vulnerability that was reported, right? And ever since then, there has been tons of vulnerabilities as well. So enumeration is also a powerful concept. And as an ethical hacker, except you're not dealing with IP-based infrastructure, you would always perform enumeration for a successful ethical hacking or bug hunting. So, having defined these various terminologies of passive recon, active recon, and enumeration, let's move on to the next slide. So let's compare these various processes when it comes to bug bounty hunting or ethical hacking. Now, at Fixed Gateway Security, we classify this in accordance to nature of its results, data discovered, data clarification, level of interaction, cyber law breach, and tools. So for passive recon, the nature of the result is hypothetical. And you might be saying, but it's the organization, right? Why is it hypothetical? Okay, you can also remember that in life, most people have the opinion that if you don't know something, say that you can and go read about it on how you can. Now, an organization can list all those resources as the job requirement, not because they have, but because they want to use those resources in their new infrastructure or to start up their business, right? So you might get this information and swung in straight to perform recon. Like, okay, just pick the organization's IP address or domain and start testing for Active Directory. And you discover there is no Active Directory. You test for SSH, you discover there is no SSH, right? And you feel heartbroken. Maybe your tool is not working. But the truth of the matter is maybe the organization just listed it because they intended to provision such services in their infrastructure. Let's say, for instance, an organization can say, we want someone who is familiar with AWS, right? But currently they are using on-premise cloud, but they are planning to move all their data to all cloud or migrate all their data to all cloud. So they need an experienced cloud professional to be able to carry out these processes, right? So if you had just moved on to test the organization to see if they have a cloud without refining your data through active recon, you're definitely going to be landing with void results or no effort result. Now, in terms of the nature of result, active recon is empirical. So you're talking about empirical here. We're talking about this is based on facts. You have tested that these are valid through pinging, through scanning, through the use of your various tools. And the result you've seen so far has given you an insight that, okay, these domain names, these links are active and they are valid. It could also be directly visiting these links via your web browser, right? Or using tools to, probe the network. And of course, this is a direct interaction. You're dealing directly with this infrastructure, not from third-party sources. And with these dealings, you're able to see for yourself that this is actually true about this organization. Now, for enumeration, it's still the same, still applies. It's empirical, even a more advanced empirical nature of result, because you're not just getting these responses in terms of the open services, you're also discovering the versions which those services are being run on. And these versions are also a vital way to discover your POCs or research your POCs to further exploit this target. Now, on data discovery, for passive recon is a general information. It's just an information generally shared by users of the internet. It can also be an information shared by the blog expert of the organization. It could also be a general information that is, gotten through various passive recon tools crawling the internet. So it's a general information. There is nothing so specific about it. Now, for active recon, we classified it as specific information and status code. So what is specific information? For example, if I get a domain API dot whatever gibbrishdata.com, I can say api.fixitgearware.com. Let's make it more professional. Now, and I try to test api.fixitgearware.com and I get a status code of 200. So what it tells me is that the API URL is valid and it's live. So 200 means okay. I can ping this URL and I can get result. So you can see we have gotten a specific information in terms of the API. First of all, we have gotten the information that this API is actually real, and the status code is a confirmation that, okay, yes, it is also live. Now, for enumeration, enumeration takes a more deeper sense of discovery in the sense that it's a specific information, status codes, and confirmation. So, what is specific information? Of course, we are testing this URL, it's pinging it, okay, this is valid, right? But what is the status code? So, if we have a 200, okay, or if we have open nmap, for example, it's going to tell us the port is open, right? Now, what is the confirmation? The confirmation is the specific services that this port is running on. So it's not just a port. It doesn't just give us a value like it's port 22 for SSH, right? It's telling us this is port 22 and I can confirm this port 22 is running SSH. You see the difference, right? We have moved from general information to specific information and status code. And now we are now dealing with specific information, status code, and confirmation of the whole process that we are trying to uncover. And now you can see how beautiful it is if you follow the right order of these processes when conducting your penetration testing. Now let's talk about data clarification. So all this data, like we acquire from the internet about this target, like we said previously, is hypothetical. So whatever deductions we are making as the ethical hacker, which of course is the pragmatic approach of thinking outside the box, is based on our own assumption from the information we gathered from online resources. So it's not really considered a perfect clarification, but it's a clue. Like forensic investigators, right? Whenever they try to investigate a crime scene, they use clues before they are able to get facts, right? So these clues can be hints, it can be histories, it can be um, softwares that were installed, it could be anything. But these clues are assumptions which are now used to build the real facts, right? Now, for active recon, it's the data clarification is verification. So it's verified because now we are dealing directly with the organization. We are not researching the organization using third-party resources such as Google or the dark web. We are now dealing with what belongs to the organization. So it's a case of what you see is what you get. So if we're dealing directly with this organization, right, the verification process is definitely based on what we have been able to obtain while we are dealing with this target. So the data clarification is verified. So if we have a 200 okay means this URL is okay. If we have a 403 forbidden, it means it's a 403 forbidden because we are dealing directly or interacting directly with this target. Now, for data clarification, it's called validation. So when you say something is validated, it means despite all odds, it is what it is. So even if you come back the next day to scan that target, as long as these services or the port is open and there has not been any changes, it is what it is. So let's say, for instance, you scan and it detects that there's a Windows 7 running on this IP or domain name that you fed the nmap to, and this Windows 7 is of this version, right? It is what it is. Even if you physically go into this infrastructure and check this operating system, this is exactly what you will see. So the data clarification is validated. So we are now validating this data by the result thrown at us or revealed to us by the nmap2. Now, level of interaction. Because we are not directly interacting with the target, so the level of interaction for passive recon is considered indirect. For active recon, we are directly interacting with this target, so it is considered a direct interaction or level of interaction. So also for enumeration, the interaction is a direct interaction, and we are considering this as a direct level of interaction. Now, let's talk about cyber law and breaches. In cybersecurity, anything you do is governed by law, and you don't want to find yourself committing perjury. Okay? Committing perjury is very, 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 very offensive, and it comes with a fine. And this fine could be monetary values, or of course, it could be a jail time. So whatever you do, be smart enough not to, go against the law, be it an organization or offending the government. Always stay away from troubles when it comes to the law. Except you want to do the time, then not have any other option to tell you than to do the crime if that's what you want. But in the normal circumstances, stay away from troubles, stay away from offending the law. The law is above everyone. Nobody is above the law, not even the government. Maybe they could be shielded temporarily while they're in position. But once they're off position, definitely they will definitely face the law. So cyber law and breaches in cybersecurity are very important. Now, when it comes to passive recon, there is no law you're breaching because passive recon is you're just researching. You can also claim that you're researching about this organization for research purposes. You want to write an article, or you want to publish a post, or you want to use it for a presentation, and that's it. So this is not considered a crime when you're conducting passive recon. Now, for active recon, somewhat in a way, you're breaching the law. Now, why did we say somewhat in a way? Because as a bug bounty hunter, you have the authorization, of course. You also have to follow the rules of engagement, right? So there is no law in that aspect. But let's say this organization is just a random organization and you just ended up pen testing them. Now, see where the problem is. You pen tested them without having a written permission, right? Okay, let's take that you are trying to uncover something and report as building your own brand or gaining reputation with the organization. But now you didn't just only test, your testing was able to create an outage. So after you tested the organization, their infrastructure collapsed. You were not able to conduct services and business for the next 24 hours or 48 hours because of your testing. Definitely, you have breached the law. You were not given permission to do that, and not just not given permission to do that. You definitely now did something that was able to break their system. So, in such cases, the organization for sure would definitely sue you. And of course, such act is an act of perjury. And you would have to pay either a fine or you might be jailed. Now, for a non ethical hacker, definitely there is no two ways to it. They are definitely going to do the jail time, right? So, whenever you're performing active recon, if it's not a bug bounty program, then please do seek a written permission before carrying out your activities. But in the eventuality that you don't want to seek permission first, you just want to do this so that you can, you know, use this method to market your presence with the organization. Make sure that whatever you're doing is not able to put the organization out of business temporarily or even cause damage to the infrastructure. Now for enumeration. Enumeration in terms of cyber law and breach is totally, there is no exception because you and I know that when someone is enumerating a service, you're getting more information about that service. So as an organization, to us, our question would be, why are you enumerating this much information about us? There is certainly something you're up to, and definitely is up to no good, right? So if you're eventually discovered or your IP was noticed on the network and you did this outside the bug bounty rules, no, it's not even that the organization, you know, has a bounty program. You did also conduct your enumeration outside the bug bounty rules. Despite it's a campaign, you can be sued because they have outlined their rules. They have strictly said this is what is not permissible. This is a range of IP we don't want you to test or scan. Now, you did not only scan, you try to pull out sensitive information using your scans. And you don't just end up pulling out the sensitive information using your scans. Your scans were the reason why the network do not have an uptime anymore. So you're definitely going to jail or you're definitely going to pay a fine. So you see how these various phases of recon are very dangerous. So it's not about using tools or giving you automation tools. Have a clear understanding of these various phases of um, pen testing in terms of the recon approach and enumeration approach so that you can know what you're doing and most importantly, ensure that you're not going against the law. Now on tools, for passive recon tools, we have a list of tools here. We cannot read all this, but it's in the presentation slide. We just read a few. So for Google, simple search, you can use it. Bing search, simple search. The dark web, you research for resources such as leaked credentials, leaked database. You want to use these credentials and see if there are organizations who are also using these usernames and password in their default logins. So for Instagram, a lot of people have been asking, how can you use Instagram as your recon? It's not just about username enumeration, like for social engineering, right? Most organizations talk about their jobs on their social media pages. And Instagram is also not excluded. It could be them taking pictures of a particular server they just installed. It could be them taking a picture of a presentation or conference and describing what was spoken about in that conference. So Instagram also should not be overlooked. As a matter of fact, if you're performing your passive recon, always look out for Instagram. Facebook is easy. Of course, there are a lot of informations on Facebook, so we wouldn't be talking about that. And as like we previously said, job ads, newspapers and magazines as well. Now for WhatsApp channels, okay. Um, WhatsApp channels are the new form of advertising. If you have to check your status icon area of the WhatsApp, you can see organizations like sports channels, news channels. They talk about everything every day, right? Organizations also can enroll and they pay a certain fee per day. I think about 99 cents or $1 per day for these ads. So once they pay, they can be able to be featured on these various channel pages. So always look out for your passive information or conduct your passive recon approach using these various platforms. Now for active recon, we have a lot of tools. We have the AMRs, we have the HTTPX, we have the Nmap, we have the mass scan, and we also have the SQL map and password cracking tools. So SQL map, we know is for database, right? So know about these tools. It's very important. Now for enumeration, we have Wapalizer. You know, this has been a very, very good argument I had with one of my friends. I discussed with them and I said, Wapalizer should not be considered a recon tool for active. It should be considered an enumeration tool. And they said, how? Like I said, okay, remember when we talk about enumeration, we're talking about banner grabbing. And what is banner grabbing? It identifies the framework or the operating system and the version, right? Now, when you use Wapalizer plugin on your browser, Wapalizer is not only able to detect the server, it also detects the version of the server, right? And if it's framework, it's not only able to detect this framework, it also detects the version of these various frameworks. So Wapalizer should be considered, once again, as an enumeration tool and not an active recon tool. So we have the Nmap, we also have the Metasploit. I know you might be thinking, how is Metasploit an enumeration tool? So for example, you discover that your target uses a specific Windows operating system and you're not sure if it's vulnerable to a particular um, popular vulnerabilities that is trending. Metasploit has what we call the auxiliary. So auxiliary is like a test, right? Auxiliary scans the target to test if that target is vulnerable. So you can provide your IP address and use Metasploit. And Metasploit is going to enumerate the system to tell you if it's vulnerable or not. So understand all this, understand all these tools and how they are used. So the rest of the tool is still here on the list. We cannot explain all this so that we don't exceed more than an hour with this video. And with these tools, you can also research more about them and get more information in terms of their functionalities. Now, moving on to the next slide. What is the right order in carrying out the recons and enums? So the right step you should, as a penetration tester and bug bounty hunter, is to follow these processes. I know a lot of like I've been reporting bugs, I've not been gotten bugs. Aside the competition out there, your process also matters a lot. Okay? Get your process right. And of course, you definitely get your result right. So what do you do? First, conduct your passive recon, learn about the organization, learn about their businesses, get informations about them. Just take 2, 3, 4 hours, 5 hours to do this. Recon is not like an entire day. Okay, you can use 1 hour to do your passive recon. Use another 30 minutes to do your active recon because active recon now is automated, right? So it's not that difficult. But passive recon is not automated. You have to think by yourself, think for yourself, and think all through yourself. So using passive recon, you can get more information which active recon cannot pull because the same tool you're using, the rest of the hackers out there are also using the same tool, right? And there's a competition. And when there is a competition, everybody has what the same result. Then after you're done with your passive recon, you move on to active recon. So active recon, you test the various information you gathered using your passive approach. Then once you're done and you want to have a more deeper understanding about the target, you can now go on to enumeration. But in some cases, you might not end up moving on to enumeration. It might just be active recon and you further start exploiting. Yes, but whichever way it is, if you really want to get an optimum result, you have to go through these phases or through this order in order to achieve those results. And that's it for this week on our Tools Friday, explaining recon in terms of the passive reconnaissance, active reconnaissance, and enumeration. And we hope with this explanation, you have come to appreciate these various concepts in cybersecurity when it comes to ethical hacking and penetration testing. And so with that, we have finally come to an end of this week's episode. If you find this video interesting, please do not hesitate to give us a like by hitting that thumbs up button. Subscribe by hitting that subscribe button and hit the notification bell to get notified when next we publish a new episode on Tools Friday with FIXITGEARWARE-SECURITY. Thanks for watching and see you next week. Bye for now.